Hello guys, welcome back. When you ask most people about Cyclops, they'll probably say he's the X-Man with laser eyes, or the guy who is always arguing with Wolverine. And that is how he is often remembered in movies and cartoons. But if that's all you know about Scott Summers, then you're probably missing out on one of the most interesting characters in Marvel Comics. Cyclops wasn't just a man who fired powerful beams from his eyes. He was one of the X-Men's greatest tacticians, a leader who had earned the trust of heroes, far stronger than himself, and someone who spent years carrying the weight of Xavier's dream. As mutantkind faced one disaster after another, Scott had to make decisions that divided the X-Men, the superhero community, and even the fans who read the comics. So today we'll be breaking down the heroic anatomy of Cyclops, from how his optic blasts really work, to the decisions that turned Professor Xavier's first student into one of Marvel's most debated heroes. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get started. How do Cyclops' optic blasts actually work? One of the biggest myths about Cyclops is that he shoots lasers from his eyes. He actually doesn't. Scott Summers' optic blasts are not conventional lasers, and they aren't heat vision either. Instead, they are powerful blasts of concussive force. When they hit something, they don't normally burn it like fire. They strike with incredible physical power, almost like being hit by a massive moving object. That is why Cyclops can knock enemies across a room, punch through thick walls, or send giant sentinels crashing backwards. The damage usually comes from the impact, not heat. Over the years, Marvel has given different explanations for where this energy actually comes from. Marvel's official explanation describes Scott's body as absorbing ambient energy and allowing his eyes to function as apertures connected to an extra-dimensional source of powerful particles. No matter which explanation a particular story emphasizes, one thing usually stays the same. Scott cannot normally shut the blasts off at will. Unlike many superheroes, Scott does not have the choice to simply switch his ability on and off whenever he wants. His control does not come from activating his power. It comes from blocking and regulating them. This is why Cyclops depends on ruby quartz glasses and his famous visor. Ruby quartz is one of the few materials capable of safely blocking his optic blasts. As long as he is wearing his glasses or his visor remains closed, the energy is contained. But the moment that protection is removed and his eyes open, the blasts pour out. This makes Scott's power very different from someone like Storm or the Human Torch. They can usually choose when to activate their abilities. Scott doesn't really have that choice. His power is something he has to manage every hour of every day, and that constant danger goes back to his childhood. After suffering a serious head injury when he was young, Scott lost the natural ability to shut off his optic blasts. Different comics have also suggested that psychological trauma contributed to his lack of control. Professor Xavier later helped him develop mental discipline, but even Xavier could not permanently give him complete control over his eyes. That is why Scott has relied on ruby quartz protection for most of his life. I mean, imagine never being able to make direct eye contact with another person unless you are wearing special glasses. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that forgetting one piece of equipment could seriously hurt someone you care about. That has been Scott Summers' reality since childhood. After living with a power like that for so many years, thinking before acting simply became part of his nature. For Scott, controlling his power didn't stop when a mission ended. It was part of his daily routine, something he had to do all the time. Before he could become the X-Men's leader, he first had to learn how to live with a power that never truly switched off. What does the visor say about his relationship with control? The visor is one of the first things people notice about Cyclops. It is so closely tied to the character that it is almost impossible to imagine him without it. But the visor isn't just part of his costume. It is something Scott depends upon every single day. Most people think the visor simply opens and closes to let the optic blasts out, but it actually does more than that. Scott can adjust the opening to regulate the amount and shape of the blast he releases. He can fire a thin, focused beam to hit a small target or widen it to push back several enemies at once. Instead of aiming directly at a person, Scott can destroy the weapon they are holding. If civilians are trapped behind a blocked doorway, he can blast the debris away without bringing the entire building down. Every shot is planned carefully because he knows exactly what his powers are capable of. The visor also says a lot about Scott as a person. For most superheroes, using their powers is a choice, but for Scott, control comes first. worst. He has spent his entire life making sure his powers don't hurt the people around him, and over time, that careful mindset became part of his personality. He rarely rushes into a fight. He thinks ahead, stays calm under pressure, and looks for the safest or most effective way to handle a situation. Those habits did not come only from combat or tactical training. They started with something far simpler, which was learning how to live with a power he couldn't switch off. And once Scott learned to manage his own powers, he started using them in ways few people could predict. His optic blasts weren't just weapons anymore. They became tools he could shape around the battlefield itself.
Up.
How does Cyclops use geometry and strategy in combat? On paper, Cyclops' power doesn't sound very complicated. He fires red optic blasts from his eyes. Compared with mutants who can control the weather, read minds, or bend metal, that doesn't seem especially creative. But Scott has never relied on raw power alone. He wins fights because he knows how to use his abilities better than almost anyone else. Over the years, the comics have shown that Scott is always thinking about angles, distance, timing, and the environment around him. He doesn't just point at an enemy and fire. Before he takes a shot, he is already working out where the blast will go, what it might hit, and how it could affect everyone on the battlefield. One of his most famous tricks is using ricochets. Instead of firing directly at an opponent, Scott often bounces his optic blast off walls, ceilings, metal beams, or even the ground. The blast changes direction and hits enemies who thought they were safely behind cover. To anyone watching, it almost looks impossible, but for Scott, it is another calculation. He has practiced with his powers for so many years that judging angles has become second nature. His optic blasts also let him change the battlefield itself. If an enemy is hiding behind a wall, Scott might destroy the wall instead of chasing them. If civilians are trapped inside a building, he can blast through rubble to create an escape route. Against giant enemies like sentinels, he often targets their surroundings instead of attacking them head-on. Bringing down part of a bridge or damaging the ground beneath them can be far more effective than simply firing at their armor. Scott doesn't just fight his enemies, he controls the space around them. That makes him incredibly valuable during team missions. While other heroes focus on the opponent in front of them, Scott is paying attention to everything happening around him. He knows where Storm is flying. He knows where Nightcrawler is about to teleport. He knows where Colossus is ready to charge. He knows when Wolverine needs an opening. Every decision is made with the entire team in mind. That is why Cyclops is often described as the X-Men's field commander, instead of just another member of the team. His optic blasts become much more dangerous when they work together with everyone else's powers. Scott doesn't try to do everything himself. He makes everyone around him more effective. His real strength isn't just accuracy, it is awareness. He sees the battlefield as one complete picture, and that is exactly why Professor Xavier trusted him to lead. Why is Cyclops the X-Men's default field leader? From the very beginning of the X-Men comics, Professor Xavier saw something special in Scott Summers. He wasn't just another student learning how to control his mutant abilities. Xavier believed Scott had what it took to lead. That trust showed up early. In the original X-Men comics, Scott was regularly put in charge whenever the team went into the field. Later, during Chris Claremont's run on Uncanny X-Men, that responsibility continued, although Scott was not always the team's active leader. Storm also became one of the X-Men's greatest leaders and defeated Scott in a famous contest for command. The team became much bigger and added heroes like Storm, Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Wolverine. Whenever Scott was leading, however, the others often trusted him to make the final tactical decision. It wasn't because he was the strongest person in the room. Far from it, actually. Storm could control the weather, Jean Grey possessed extraordinary telepathic and telekinetic powers, and Magneto could reshape an entire battlefield. Even so, Scott repeatedly earned the right to call the shots. Scott never really saw leadership as a chance to stand in the spotlight. While everyone else was focused on the immediate fight, he was thinking about the bigger picture. Who was out of position? Who needed help? Should the team keep pushing forward, or was it smarter to pull back? Sometimes the right call was to attack, and sometimes it was to retreat. Scott knew there was no point in winning a battle if his team could not make it home at the end of the day. And that was exactly why people trusted him. He believed every mission should have a plan, and every team teammates should understand their role. Even heroes who argued with Scott acknowledged that he stayed calm when everyone else was losing their minds. His reputation eventually spread beyond the X-Men. Captain America and other experienced heroes have recognized Cyclops as an exceptionally capable strategist and field commander. And none of that happened overnight, did it? It came from years of making difficult calls, accepting responsibility when plans didn't work, and putting the team's safety ahead of his own. Leading the X-Men wasn't something only Scott could do, but it became the role everyone expected him to be capable of filling. The problem was that every new crisis brought even more responsibility, and after watching mutantkind go through one tragedy after another, Scott slowly began to question whether Xavier's dream was enough to keep his people alive. How does being the face of mutant heroism wear him down? Leading the X-Men was never supposed to be easy, but for Scott Summers, it slowly became much more than leading a superhero team. He was carrying Professor Xavier's dream on his shoulders. Every time the X-Men saved lives, people saw it as proof that mutants and humans could live together peacefully. But every time something went wrong, Scott felt as though he had failed, not just his team, but all of mutantkind. That pressure only grew as the years went on, and one of the biggest turning points came during Grant Morrison's New X-Men, where the mutant nation of Genosha was destroyed. A Sentinel attack killed approximately 16 million mutants in a matter of minutes. The X-Men couldn't stop it, Scott couldn't stop it, and it was one of the greatest tragedies mutantkind had ever faced. Not long after that came another disaster. During House of M, Scarlet Witch uttered 3 simple words: "No more mutants." In an instant, almost the entire mutant population lost its powers. The event became known as M-Day, or the Decimation. Mutants were no longer fighting only for equality, they were fighting to survive. Scott watched his people become an endangered species almost overnight. For someone who had spent his whole life believing in Xavier's dream, it was devastating. He began to ask himself a question that had never seemed so important before. What if doing the right thing simply wasn't enough anymore? That question stayed with him. Every attack on mutants, every funeral, every friend he couldn't save, and every new tragedy made it harder to believe that hope alone could protect his people. Scott didn't completely stop believing in Xavier's dream, but he began to believe that the methods used to pursue it had to change if mutants were going to survive. And that shift in thinking would define the next chapter of his life. What changes when Cyclops starts running mutant survival like a war? The Utopia era. By the time Messiah Complex began, Scott Summers was no longer thinking only like the headmaster of a school. He was thinking like the commander of a population facing extinction. After M-Day, every surviving mutant mattered. Then, for the first time since the decimation, a mutant child was born. Her name was Hope Summers. To some people, she was a threat. To others, she was a weapon. But to Scott, she represented exactly what her name suggested. Hope. Protecting her became one of the X-Men's most important missions. It also forced Scott to make some of the hardest decisions of his life. As attacks against mutants continued, Scott realized Xavier's school was no longer enough. Mutants needed a place where they could gather and defend themselves, and that idea eventually led to Utopia. Established on the raised remains of Magneto's former asteroid M off the coast of San Francisco, Utopia became more than a headquarters. It became a sovereign mutant homeland. For the first time, Scott wasn't merely leading an X-Men team. He was protecting most of the surviving mutant population gathered in one place, and that changed everything. Every decision now affected an entire community. Scott had to think about security, resources, diplomacy, and the future of mutantkind, not only the next battle. His leadership became much more practical and militarized. One of the clearest examples was his decision to secretly authorize X-Force. Unlike the public X-Men, this version of X-Force handled missions involving assassination and lethal force. Scott knew Professor Xavier would never have approved. He also knew many of his teammates would have struggled with that decision. But Scott believed the world had changed. He wasn't trying to win public approval anymore. He was trying to keep his people alive. And to him, those were two very different things. This period is why so many fans began saying Cyclops was right. Supporters argued that Scott understood the reality mutants were living in. They believed peaceful ideals alone could not stop extinction. Others strongly disagreed. They believed Scott had crossed moral lines that the X-Men should never cross, no matter how desperate the situation became. The comics never really gave an easy answer. Instead, they asked a difficult question. If your people were on the edge of extinction, how far would you go to save them? Scott believed he was doing what had to be done. Whether readers agreed with him or not, one thing was clear. The boy who once followed Professor Xavier without question had become a leader willing to make impossible choices. And those choices would soon lead to the biggest disagreement in X-Men history, because the person who challenged Scott the most wasn't Magneto, it was Wolverine. How does Cyclops' conflict with Wolverine in Schism reveal his values? By the time X-Men Schism began, Scott Summers and Wolverine had already been disagreeing for years. Sometimes it was about leadership, and sometimes it was personal. But underneath all of that was one important question. What did it really mean to protect the next generation? Scott believed mutants were already at war. Every year, more enemies appeared and more mutants died. More children grew up in a world that feared and hated them. To Scott, pretending they could live normal lives was dangerous. He believed he was preparing them for the world they already lived in. But Wolverine saw things very differently. He had spent much of his own life being used as a weapon. He knew what happened when children were forced to fight before they were ready. To him, the school's purpose was simple. Children deserved a childhood, and adults should carry the burden of war instead. The immediate conflict became especially serious after Scott ordered the young mutant E-Day to use lethal force against members of the Hellfire Club. Wolverine also opposed Scott's decision to allow young mutants to fight during a Sentinel attack on Utopia. That disagreement grew until the X-Men split into two groups. Wolverine left to reopen the school as the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning, focusing on education and protecting young mutants. Scott stayed on Utopia and believed survival had to come first. What made Schism so interesting was that neither hero was completely wrong. Scott wasn't acting only out of anger. He was acting out of fear that mutantkind would not survive if its younger members were completely unprepared. Logan wasn't ignoring reality. He was trying to stop another generation from growing up the way he did. It was one of Marvel's best examples of two heroes wanting the same thing, but choosing completely different paths. By now, Scott's idea of heroism had clearly changed. When he was younger, being a hero meant following Xavier's dream. Now it meant making sure there were still mutants alive to believe in that dream at all. And soon, that belief would be tested more than ever before. How does becoming part of the Phoenix Five in Avengers vs. X-Men reshape him? When Avengers vs. X-Men began, Scott believed the Phoenix Force was coming to Earth because of Hope Summers. He believed Hope could control its power and use it to restart the mutant race. The Avengers didn't agree. They saw the Phoenix as one of the most dangerous forces in the universe and wanted to contain the situation before it reached Earth. That disagreement quickly turned into a war between the Avengers and the X-Men. But things didn't happen the way either side expected. When Iron Man attempted to disrupt the Phoenix Force, he accidentally split its power between 5 mutants: Cyclops, Emma Frost, Namor, Colossus, and Magic. Together, they became known as the Phoenix Five. At first, everything seemed to be working. Using their incredible powers, the Phoenix Five began changing the world. They created new sources of energy and food, destroyed weapons, and intervened in international conflicts. For a while, it even looked as though Scott's plan had worked. But the Phoenix Force always came with a price. The more power its hosts gained, the harder it became for them to accept criticism or limitations. They slowly began believing that only they knew what was best for the world. As the story continued, the other Phoenix hosts were defeated, and their portions of the Force passed into the remaining members. Scott eventually took Emma Frost's share and carried the full Phoenix Force alone. Now he was stronger than ever before, but he was also losing himself. The careful discipline that had defined Cyclops for decades began to disappear under the Phoenix's influence. Instead of listening to others, he started believing anyone who disagreed with him was standing in the way of progress. That led to one of the darkest moments in X-Men history. Professor Xavier confronted Scott, hoping to stop him before it was too late. The two fought, and during that battle, the Phoenix corrupted Cyclops killed the man who had raised him. It is important to remember that Scott was under the Phoenix Force's influence at this point. The cosmic power was twisting his thoughts and pushing his emotions to dangerous extremes. But that did not change the outcome. When the Phoenix was finally defeated, Xavier was dead. For Scott Summers, this became one of the greatest failures of his life. The student who had spent years trying to protect Xavier's dream had killed its founder. His power had never been the central problem. Losing control was. And when the Phoenix disappeared, Scott was left to face the consequences. Is Cyclops still a hero after killing Professor Xavier? After Avengers vs. X-Men, one question followed Scott Summers everywhere he went. Was Cyclops still a hero? And there wasn't one simple answer. Many heroes blamed Scott for Xavier's death. To them, he had crossed a line that could never be undone, even if the Phoenix Force had influenced his actions. Others saw things differently. They remembered everything Scott had done before the Phoenix arrived. They remembered Genosha, M-Day, Utopia, and the years he had spent carrying the weight of mutantkind. They didn't excuse what happened, but they also didn't believe one terrible moment erased an entire lifetime of sacrifice. Scott did not pretend that Xavier's death had never happened. He knew what he had done and understood that he would have to live with it. At the same time, he refused to stop fighting for mutantkind. Instead of walking away, he kept moving forward. He believed his people still needed someone willing to stand up for them. This was where Cyclops had changed the most. He was no longer the perfect student who always followed the rules. He was a leader with scars, a man who had made mistakes, and a man who had paid a heavy price for those mistakes. Whether readers forgave him or not, Scott never stopped trying to protect mutantkind. That commitment is the reason many fans still saw him as a hero. Not because he was perfect, but because he kept carrying the responsibility even after everything that had happened. How did Krakoa and the new mutant nation change Cyclops' role? The next major change came with House of X and Powers of X. For the first time in decades, mutants gained something they had always wanted, a powerful and internationally recognized nation of their own. Krakoa changed almost everything. Instead of constantly fighting simply to survive, mutants had a home where they could build a future together. It also changed Scott's place in that future. During the Utopia years, it often felt as though the survival of mutantkind rested on his shoulders. On Krakoa, that responsibility was shared. Professor Xavier, Magneto, Moira McTaggart, and their allies had secretly laid the foundations for the nation. The Quiet Council governed Krakoa, while its captains handled military defense. Scott served as Captain Commander, placing him in charge of Krakoa's defense structure. He later stepped away from that position to help form a publicly elected X-Men team. Scott was still one of the X-Men's most important leaders, but he no longer had to carry every burden alone. That gave him something he had not possessed in years, the chance to simply be Scott Summers. He continued leading missions, but he also spent more time with Jean Grey and the wider Summers family. He wasn't forced to spend every waking moment believing that mutant survival depended entirely upon him. In many ways, Krakoa proved that some of Scott's earlier goals could be achieved. Mutants had their own nation, greater security, resurrection, and the possibility of a future. At the same time, Krakoa also showed that no single leader should carry the weight of an entire people alone. Scott's role became healthier for a time. He was still a commander, but he could also be a husband, a father, and a teammate again. The pressure that had defined so much of him was finally shared by others. However, Krakoa ultimately fell during the conflict with Orchis in 2024. Scott was captured, placed on trial, and later returned to leading an X-Men team in the post-Krakoa era. So, Krakoa did not permanently solve mutantkind's problems, but it gave Scott a rare period in which leadership was no longer his burden alone.
Don't! I surrender! Not.
How do adaptations simplify or highlight his heroic traits? If you've only seen Cyclops in movies, you might have wondered why comic fans respect him so much. That is because many adaptations show only part of his character. The 1990s X-Men animated series and X-Men 97 came much closer to the comics. They showed Scott as a disciplined field leader who kept the team together during missions. His tactical thinking, calm personality, emotional restraint, and precise use of his optic blasts were all important parts of his character. The live-action X-Men films took a different approach. While James Marsden did a good job with the material he was given, the movies often pushed Cyclops into the background. Much of his role was reduced to the love triangle between Scott, Jean Grey, and Wolverine. As a result, audiences missed many of the stories that made Cyclops such a complicated character. They didn't see Utopia, they didn't see Schism, they didn't see the moral debates that turned him into one of Marvel's most discussed leaders. That is why so many people have completely different opinions of Cyclops, depending on whether they know him from the comics or from the movies. When you really look at Cyclops, you realize his story was never only about shooting optic blasts. His real strength has always been control. He learned to live with a power he couldn't switch off, He became the X-Men's trusted field commander because he stayed calm when everyone else was losing their heads. And when mutantkind faced its darkest years, he made choices that many heroes never wanted to make. Some people believed those choices saved his people. Others believed they pushed him too far. That debate is exactly what makes Scott Summers such an interesting character. He wasn't a perfect hero, nor was he a perfect leader. He was a man who spent his entire life trying to protect his people, even when every choice came with a cost. And maybe that was the real heroic anatomy of Cyclops. It wasn't found only in his optic blasts, it was found in his discipline, his leadership, and his willingness to carry responsibilities that most people would never want. But what do you think? Was Cyclops right, or did he lose his way along the journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if there's another Marvel or DC character you'd like us to break down next, tell us that too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.